All right, everybody. So we're now going to be going into the second part here of the preface. So we left off um, kind of just going through the general system that Hegel laid out, that being negativity, the subject kind of having this sort of posterior position in relation to object, even though that's not to say that it's superior, but it has an outside sort of um, perspective looking at I mean that is what its essence is. We covered the internal externalization, which is basically just to quickly give that idea another its due one more time, although you should watch the whole video we did beforehand to get a comprehensive understanding of all of it. Is subjectivity needs to sort of externalize itself into a bunch of objects in order to know itself as subject through its distinction from object, and also through those objects, or what Hegel calls substance. Subjectivity actualizes itself, and then also through that actualization it comes back into itself, knowing itself, and then back out into itself once again into the world of object. So that being said, we're going to just start here going over this first paragraph here. Hegel's going to talk about what falsity is, or falsehood is. So the false is the incomplete substance taken to be true in itself, whereas the true is the movement united to its positive and negative aspects taken as a whole in the completeness of absolute spirit. The false is the negative in itself without its relation to subject, giving its holistic completeness. To know something falsely means there is a disparity between the subject and its substance, and that the subject hasn't fully grasped the in itself, the being of the particular substance. Now, absolute knowing is the negative in itself. So you may ask then, is the absolute spirit knowing not real? The answer is obviously no, it is real, but it's inseparable from its externalizing into positive substance through which its essence as the negative moves, and this movement is necessary to its essence, as its essence is to move as movement is negativity in itself. Hence, the emphasis I've put on truth being the wholeness of the subject. I actually do believe we did cover this paragraph last time because it did qualify other parts before, but it doesn't really hurt to go over it again. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Snout. Please feel free.
Well, this is easy to understand in its essence. It's just uh, yeah. So falsehood is when uh, negativity is not in congruence or is discordant with the substance. So
Yeah.
there's some sort of break there. I don't really know how else to explain it, really.
No, I mean you're correct. It's taking something to be completely absolute and not accounting for uh, the aspects that were left out um, when you abstracted it from substance. I mean, you actually came up with a really good example last time that I think we should reiterate about apples.
Mm.
If you try to say that like an apple is sweet, um, and you define apples as a sweet thing, for example. Well, okay, it's understandable why you may say that because a lot of apples are sweet, if not most. But that's actually not entirely the truth of the matter. Plenty of us have bit into apples that were kind of like um, bland, that were like biting into a potato or something. Um, so you see here, when you abstract this notion of an apple, you're abstracting some truth from the experience of substance, but ultimately you're leaving out like a whole reality of the truth regarding what apples are. So to really,
Well, okay. Now we're talking about like subject and substance. Is that right?
yeah,
Yeah, but here in this sentence, it says the false is the negative in itself without its relation to the subject. So there's a degree of separation between negative and subject.
yeah. So there is yes, they are separate because the subjectivity is moving through um, the negative. So if you try to if you kind of have this disparity, right? And this is the second sentence, or not. Sorry, yeah, no, this is the second sentence. Um, you're kind of taking this thing, right? This because a sweet. Okay, we'll continue with this example. This sweet apple is distinct from all these other apples that also exist. So now you're implying negativity, but not in its fullest sense. That's also a problem as well, because if at that point it's no longer universal, and then it kind of collapses in on what it's supposed to be in this system. Um, so it's it's this kind of it's a one-sidedness basically. That's what falsity is. It's one-sided positivity, but also one-sided negativity, since you kind of can't have it uh, without the other. Um,
Well, the negativity comes in the exclusion of all other apples, right?
Correct. Yeah. If there's distinction, there is negativity. Um, that's necessarily implied, and you can't really posit anything without it being without negativity being implied, which we'll actually see this. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and just for anyone that's not aware of like the concrete example here, last time well, it might not have been on the recording actually. Maybe it was when we were having a conversation unrecorded. But well, the whole thing is like you say that apples are sweet, and because you bite into one that is sweet and fresh, but not all apples are sweet. Some of them are rotting on the ground. Some of them are not ripe yet. Some of them, some of them are sour, and so on and so forth. So you're not taking into account apples as a universal. You're just
Yeah.
talking about a particular apple, and the falsehood is in the implication that all apples are sweet.
Yeah. There's also
But
another way.
this falsehood is brought about through radical exclusion of all other apples to just focus on a particular apple. So it's like a narrowing of your vision.
Yeah. Also, it should also be mentioned that there's also another way that's equally true to understand that sentence that you kind of pointed out there. Um, so the false, like if something isn't, it has no being, it has a lack of being, a complete lack of existence. Like if you take a proposition that has, it's not, that's like contradictory, for example. If you were to say X is X, but X is also not X, um, that's purely negative. It's purely a nothingness at that point. Um, and that's also impossible. There is no pure nothingness, um, because you need something for there to be nothing. And even Hegel doesn't disagree with that. That's sort of where I talked about that symbiotic relation in the last episode. So, where do we leave off here? Um, to know something false, I think I read that already.
Its
Uh,
falseness is in relation. So
uh, yeah, now
third
the
paragraph.
right, but I don't know if I actually finished this first one here. Did I? I don't think I did. Or maybe I did, but
You
I don't know.
didn't?
I don't
Oh
know.
well, just read it again.
Yeah, I'll just read from the middle because that's where we kind of left off. Now, absolute knowing is the negative in itself. So you may then ask, is absolute spirit or knowing not real? The answer is no. It is real, but it's inseparable from its externalizing into positive substance through which its essence as a negative moves. And this movement is necessary to its essence, as its essence is to move, as movement is negativity in itself. Hence, the emphasis I've put on the truth being the wholeness of the subject. Yeah, that's basically just kind of reiterating what we were saying before. You know, the subject is defined by its movement. I mean, there is, if you were to say, even in the case of a particular subject, like a conscious person, if you were to say that their mind wasn't moving, if it wasn't, well, then it wouldn't be experiencing anything. If that taken to its logical conclusion is basically death, it's complete stasis. Um, so movement as such is synonymous with negativity. Now, is it possible to imagine negativity in a pure sense? No, because movement is always occurring between things. So that's why that other aspect is necessary. That positive aspect is necessary for movement to occur. Um, so I don't want because the reason I'm putting so much emphasis on this point is because when I've talked about this with people, they have understandably brought up the concern that, well, okay, if negativity is the universal and negativity is lack, then what you're saying is that the universal is just a lacking thing. It's a nothingness, and that's not what we're saying. Or that's not what Hegel is saying. I should say. What Hegel is saying is that, well, this universal is this movement itself, um, and it's not nothing. It is something, but it's also, you know, it's not a particular thing in the way that, well, a concrete object is a particular thing. It underlies all particular things, and it also underlies uh, even distinctions between universals as well. So it's sort of like a meta universal in a way you could say, because even between, and I'm not going to go too off on a tangent here, but even between, let's take two universals. Unity is a universal, and like the law of identity is universal. Now those are of course related, but they're distinct. They're distinct, and that distinction itself presupposes negativity. So even negativity underlies these universals, and the nature of universals will be something we'll talk about later on. Anyways, just going on here, its falseness is in relation to the truth. It can be said that the false is the incompleteness of the notion taken to be what it is in itself, when it is a disparity of the true in itself to the knowing subject. The false is inextricably linked to the true, but it is not to say that within every truth is a false, but rather that within every truth it is the case that it is also not something else. Therefore, the negative is always present in the positive content of the notion. X always implies being not X, which is not shown as a positive reality, but merely defined negatively. Furthermore, within each truth, as it is a notion and therefore not fully absolute or complete, it can be said to be quote unquote false in that it is not fully realized in relation to what its underlying essence is, absolute spirit. It is this here why self-movement occurs, and this is taken as a whole is synonymous with what we may call the true. Now, this is also a really, really important part that needs to be addressed. Um, you could almost say that every understanding you have, in a way, is almost a misunderstanding because you can abstract an idea, you could hold an idea, whatever you want to say, and it's somewhat true. It does tap into reality to a certain degree, but it's limited. It's not the full picture. And there can never be a full picture because pictures themselves aren't the things themselves, they're distinct. And with every understanding comes a sort of misunderstanding if you take that understanding to be absolute. That's what Hegel's getting at. He's not saying that um, every idea is like a combination of true and false. Although there may be ideas that are like that, but at least every idea is, if it's held to be absolute and it is a picture, which ideas are, they are incomplete and sort of limited, and they're kind of missing something. So they're false in that sense that they're not the fullness of the truth. And if they're taken to be absolute, then that's when they can be said to be false in some way, basically. And that's it seems really complex when you say it, but actually, the more you think about it, the more reasonable it becomes. We've all held ideas in the past that over time we've kind of realized were sort of flawed in a way. I mean, most of these, a lot of people who follow me are into politics, right? And a lot of us used to be libertarians at one point, for example. I mean, it's more of an American thing, but eventually we start to realize, oh, actually, reality really looks like this, and this is human nature, and I had a wrong idea of what human nature was, and humans act more like this, and they act like this because this is better for them. That is an example of kind of what he's talking about here. So I don't know, is there anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah. So there was something I was thinking about all throughout that sort of touched upon in this paragraph, but especially in the last paragraph that we read, which is negativity. Well, there was the implication that negativity in itself is insubstantial, it doesn't
Yeah.
have a substance. But my question then would be, how is substance manifested? Where does substance come from if it's not from within negativity?
So this is a good question, right? Because it's kind of like asking, and correct me if I'm wrong here, how can you give something you don't have? It's kind of like I had this question too. Like, how can negativity um, externalize what's not proper to it? To externalize something would mean to to have it in some way. And I think maybe like that confusion comes in if you think about it in like in a temporal sense, or like Aristotle, for example, will make a distinction between two causal chains, and anyone who's like a Thomist will probably know this, per accidents and per oh, what's the other one? I forget what the other one is, but or per essence or something like that. Uh, so basically, it's in English, it's contingent relations and necessary relations of like logical order. So I think if you were to think of this in the sense of logical order, it would make more sense in that it's this movement is still it because there can't be anything outside of it, because even if there was something outside of it, it would still imply that negative positive distinction so that it's inescapable. Um and and that's also why it's an internal externalization as well. It's not and I'm not saying you're saying it's otherwise, but like I think there's a reason why that understanding of it of an internal externalization is kind of necessary, because if it is this movement, right, and if its essence is movement, it's going to need something to move, and it's going to need, and distinction itself is proper to its essence. So I think it would just logically necessitate at that point that there are distinct things and things that are moved, because um, if it didn't have those things, then it logically couldn't be what we're saying its essence is. It would, then it would collapse. Um,
If it didn't have what things?
if it didn't have distinct things, like which is substance. I mean, every time I bring up distinction, I think
So
of that.
negativity has substance after all?
Well, it's I don't. It's wrong to say have in the sense of like well, ultimately it isn't separate from it, right? You could kind of think of it like a layer, but it is, there is no like we can speak logically of a negativity in itself, right? But it's not like you can just like strip away substance and then you would still have this negative field. If that was the case, it wouldn't exist. So it is necessary for its essence, I guess, is what I would say. But I guess maybe when I was making a distinction here, when I was saying negativity in itself, which is not possible to really like logically picture, because anytime you picture negativity, you're picturing, and here of course we're referring to pictures, we're thinking of movement, and movement always occurs between distinct things. If there wasn't distinct things, movement couldn't occur. That's undebatable.
Oh, it's
um
necessary to its essence, but how is that different from just saying that it is in its essence?
well, it isn't. But what I'm
It's not.
saying is that it's the things that are moved are distinct from movement itself. That's the point that's being made, basically.
Okay, so where does substance come from?
Well, it doesn't come. It doesn't come from anything. It's part of
Okay,
negativity
okay.
itself. It's not like that. That's why I
So we're,
referred
we're
back.
talking about eternal relations then.
Yeah, yeah. It's not like, yeah. He's well. That's why before, like I prefaced what I was about to say with the distinction between um of like causal chains, contingent causal chains, and logically necessary causal chains. Um, like contingent
This would be
causal,
logically necessary.
correct, yeah. Sort of similar to like the like Aristotle's unmoved mover, but then he has problems with that, which we'll get into. We kind of addressed it a little bit before. um so
Sure, well, I don't want to get too annoying and nitpick
no,
everything, so we can just move on. We can revisit this maybe.
yeah. um but it just no, because it's a good, it is a good question though. Like I wouldn't even call it annoying, because it's anyone who's paying attention would probably realize, I think there might be a contradiction here. It is a matter of logical relations. Here's what I would compare it to actually. If you see these debates between like Jay Dyer and Thomas or whatever, Jay Dyer will often say, and I'm not saying this is like correct. So if you're like a Catholic or whatever, don't whatever. You just got to understand why I'm bringing this up. Maybe this will be an IQ filter. I don't know, but Jay Dyer will say, well, if his essence is pure act, then he must always be actualizing, and therefore creation of the world must be eternal. And that's a problem for the Thomistic whatever. And what he's pointing to there is like, if this is logically defined in its essence as this, it necessitates this sort of eternal relation of creation to creator. And obviously it wouldn't be like a coming into being like we would see in Genesis, but
Ex nihilo,
yeah, it wouldn't be anything like
out of
that if it
nothing.
was, yeah, if it was taken to be. I guess like a good comparison I could use in both of those examples would be like, for a house to be a house, it has to have a foundation, and that foundation must always be there. Now, and a foundation can't really exist without a house. I mean, okay, you can build like a slab, right? But at that point, it wouldn't be a foundation because it's not holding anything. A foundation is defined by what it's holding up, and what's being held up is defined by in relation to its foundation. So that's another way of looking at it, I would say, or like or a flashlight that's just perpetually on.
So what's the foundation and what's the structure in this analogy?
So the foundation would be negativity, the structure would be substance. But the thing is, and like I said, because they're logically necessary, they necessitate one another. Um, and that's why I brought up the concept of like a layer. You know, you can't really strip these things. If you strip one, you lose the other, basically.
Is
Um,
substance eternal for Hegel?
so I don't really know the answer to that question, to be honest. I kind of get the vibe that it is from what I've read. I will
And
say
he
that.
also believes that negativity is eternal then.
Well, it would have to be the case then, yeah. But so
Mm.
then here's this issue, right? Because then like negativity is movement that's changed, that's time. Um, can time be eternal? That's a whole other question. That's a whole other debate. Because if time is eternal, how can you move? How can you move between instances of time without there being an infinite amount of points in between, and you can never get to one point at that. Then, so that question is sort of out of the scope of this, but it's definitely something worth investigating 100%. We probably should
Sure,
investigate
like
it.
I don't think I quite understand this yet. Um,
Yeah,
but we can move on. Maybe it'll crop up at some point in the future.
yeah. Um, so okay, so yeah, we're here on true and false. True and
Yes.
false no longer should be used once we see that once otherness as such is dissolved and all contradictions are gone, so too is the disparity between completeness and incompleteness. The false is not a positive moment of the true, but rather a lacking of the fullness of positive substance in the form of the notion. Unlike the philosophical dogmatist who says the false should be ignored, we ought to use the false, the lack of truth, to come to know the truth. It is here in which the false serves a role in coming to know the truth. Once known, the false has served its function as being the incompleteness of subject knowing substance. Once this occurs, the distinction for our knowing becomes superfluous as we have resolved the incompleteness. Beyond we move. We no longer need use of the false once through it we have come to know the truth. There it can be ignored. Um, yeah, so basically he's just saying like so, and this is of course presupposing we're using dialectical thinking, right? If we're using other forms of thinking, like the ratiocinated forms of thinking, this isn't going to occur. But if we take an idea and it's incomplete, as pretty much all ideas are. Um, and we start from that idea. We find its limitation inside of itself, because I mean that's but through thinking it through, we'll see. Oh, okay, it's false here. There's a contradiction here, and then once we see that, we then move beyond it, back into the realm of reality through thinking it through, and that's reality sort of working through us, showing that like, well, this reality is kind of saying, hey, wake up. That what you're holding in your head isn't me, or it's a part of me, but really not like what I am in myself. Um, and that's determinate negation. That's the notion working itself through the rational subject. That's kind of the theme of this whole book. So that's also a really important thing to remember.
Well,
Um,
this actually reminds me of a biblical concept called the left hand of God, which well, I mean, don't take this as gospel, right? Because I'm not a biblical scholar, but my understanding is that in the Bible, God uses evil and calamity and evil spirits in order to get people to repent and come to their senses.
yeah,
And all of this happens within God's providence. So, like, falsehood and evil has a role to play within salvation.
and also it should be mentioned here to add to what you're saying. Evil, in the Orthodox Christian view, is, and also a Catholic view, I think, as well, is a lack of the good. Evil doesn't have existence in itself, nor does the false have existence in itself for Hegel. It's
Hmm.
ultimately it's a completely it's a lacking, a total lack. Um,
It's a denaturing of the truth, would you say?
yeah, exactly. You're what nature and essence are the same thing. If you're stripping the essence of reality away, well, you no longer have reality. You can't have reality if you're taking its essence away, because then it no longer is reality at that point by definition. So, um, and it is through this, once we're sort of hit with this discrepancy, we then come to realize the truth. Now, I want to add something here, and I'm going to make this really quick because I don't want to get too lost in the woods. There's a French psychoanalyst, a lot of people know, he's talked about all the time, Lacan. Lacan is influenced by Hegel. Lacan has this concept of the real, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's directly related to this, because it kind of sounds just like this, frankly. The real is basically this idea that human beings, subjects, people with minds, um, we experience reality. Through our experience of reality, we abstract ideas and expectations. Now, when our expectations of reality are sort of destroyed, it is because reality kind of influences, or reality sort of projects itself into us and destroys what we thought it was. And that is what Lacan calls the real. Now, you can never define the real in Lacan, because to define the real in Lacan is to then once again result back in this abstract thinking, which creates that discrepancy again from what the idea is and what actually it came from. That's directly a Hegelian concept, as we've seen. And so I'll just give you a concrete example of this. Here's a humorous example. Maybe you meet a girl and she's really lovely, she's really pretty, and you go on a date, you bring her home, and um, you find out it's actually not a girl and it's a dude. Okay, well, that's reality hitting you in the face. So your expectation of what you were experiencing and what you've extracted from that and what your understanding has been completely destroyed by substance coming into contact with the subject again. And then through that, you have to reevaluate what just happened to you. And okay, well now, okay, I'm in this horrible situation. This thing tricked me. I need to get out of here. I'm going to jump out the window to save my soul. So like that would be an example of like the Lacanian real. And then even then after that, okay, this crazy thing happened to this person that evening. He got tricked by this man pretending to be a woman, and he's like, okay, well, this is what this is now. And he abstracts this concept of what that was in his head, and that too is probably wrong in some way because it's not reality; it's an idea that he got from reality. That's this in its distinction is not the same thing, therefore not it in its fullness. That's kind of like another way to think about it is, you could have, perhaps you sign up. Like when I moved out of my house, for example, I thought it was going to be roses and sunshine. It's the complete opposite. So um, that's a way in which Hegelian thought is applicable. You can sort of realize that, well, my expectations aren't always reality. We should always prepare for our expectations to be destroyed, basically. Um, so yeah, I don't know if there's anything you want to add, but um,
Not particularly.
okay. So of course, when it comes to the conversation of everyday facts of historical truth, such as, quote, how many soldiers died in the war, a concrete positive answer must be given. However, even these simple truths expressed as such aren't separate from the cognitive process of coming to know, as knowing is always moving of the subject through its substance. Even here, this must take place even to a lesser degree. So, yeah, of course, if you're going to read about history, well, you're going to have to actually go to a textbook and, you know, categorize facts in your head. And of course, those facts too might not actually grasp the whole sort of nature of the matter at hand. This is why revisionism exists, for example, um, in history. So we're about to move on to another concept here, mathematics. He's going to talk about mathematics, uh, and he says mathematics is often said to be the form of knowing which philosophy is aiming toward, and is thus higher than it, basically. However, this isn't the case, and mathematics as a form of knowing is just as limited as the science of substance. When a mathematical proof or theorem is exercised, just going to move on. One does so from outside the equation, namely with the use of cognition. This is because mathematics is pure picture thought. The cognitive process of moving dead number, which is in itself, as number, inert and not necessarily related to any other number or equation in itself. Number only becomes related when the exterior force of spirit imposes itself upon it to relate them. For example, 1 and 2 exist on their own, they are unrelated in themselves. If looked at as inert points, which they are said to be, and only related when cognition states that 2 is a product of 1 and 1 together. This relation here is the movement imposed upon the inert picture by the mind or cognition. But as a thing in itself, it's dead and completely inert, unlike substance and subject, which is the concrete world of spirit that moves. In philosophical truth, both subject and substance can be accounted for. It can finally be said that mathematics is only a fuller form of knowing when it is applied to the world of substance. For example, one car is a more concrete use than just one as such. It must always be attached to substance to be worthwhile in knowing. I mean, that's just kind of true, right? Like, try to imagine one in itself. I mean, okay, maybe you'll picture like the number one in your head as it's written out it on paper. That's still a distinct thing. It's still, it's not one as such. It's universal that can be applied to a plethora of things. There is also, Hegel says, a difference between the way in which substance comes to be, the externalization of subject into substance, and the way in which it comes to be known, the grasping of it back into the subject as notion. The distinction is the basis for the discrepancy between picture thought and knowing beyond it. The analysis of substance is distinct from the substance as it is, and since we can never fully grasp it in the notion, we always have room for further investigation of its existence. Now, philosophical thought in its act of taking the movement of substance into the notion, turns it into being for another. That is to say, it turns it into a notion which is related to others, either other self consciousnesses of an individual or of another substance which it has relation to. This is the essence of philosophical science. So, um, this is interesting here. It relates it to other things. It also relates it to what it is in itself. That I should have qualified on that as well. Um, As regard geometric proofs of a triangle, we have here once again this inert deadness of picture, of pure picture. The formulation of a triangle is done so along the lines of set rules of geometry. However, these lines do not form themselves because they are not philosophical notions directly related to the substance which they come from. Rather, cognition, or the ever moving stream of the subject, must do the labor of negation, which it does through moving the notion, but it does so much easier with the notion, as I've mentioned hitherto, when it's directly related to its origin in self moving substance. However, since math is inert and totally void from substance, it has no inner necessity for self movement. There's a really important part here I want to kind of talk about. So, when you have these sort of dead pictures in math that we kind of just talked about before, and they're completely abstract, they don't exist in any concrete sense, and you could point to one thing in substance for sure, but that's not the same thing as one in and of itself. Like one car and one dog, they're both one thing, but they're not the one itself. But that concept is a purely abstract thing. Same thing with every other number. And Hegel says, look, mathematics doesn't really tell us about the world of substance, how substance acts, its movement, why it's moving, how it's moving, what movement is. It kind of just sort of it has its use, of course, but what it's really doing is just helping us categorize things into distinct sort of forms. That's about it. We need that to reason for sure, but if we say that's the highest form of knowing, we end up just kind of stuck in this like rigid system that's not moving like the world around us is moving. One doesn't ever change. It's always one, two, three, and onward. They all stay the same. Um, but
But earlier you said it can finally be said that mathematics is only a fuller form of knowing when it is applied to the world of substance.
correct, yeah,
So it has an explanatory
yeah.
power within
Yeah. Well,
substance, even if you
that.
can't describe the whole of it. I'm assuming that's what you mean.
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. Yeah, so that's not like a contradiction at all because what I'm saying is that if you just look at math itself, right? okay, you're moving abstract numbers. That's not really telling me about the world that I'm experiencing. Now, it's not to say that it's useless, and Hegel isn't saying that it's useless. It's sort of like it's a categorization tool, if anything. And I want to make sure that's clear. Like Hegel isn't saying that science and math we should throw them out. That's not what he's saying at all. He's just saying that people are taking these things to be more than what they are, and that's a problem. They can explain things in the world for sure, but if they and this is what people still do this today actually. If they're taken to be explanatory things in themselves, they're not. They're dead pictures. They don't move. We have to move them, and when we move them, we have to relate them to the actual world that's moving around us. So we have to understand what this thing is, and we sort of have a misunderstanding of it, and that's what he's getting at. And in practice, I mean, you like mathematics when it's applied, it is relating back to the world of substance. If you're an engineer, that's like, yes, you're using math to then sort of manipulate the world in a way that you want. But we have to understand that ultimately mathematics is limited in and of itself. It's just reposed thought um, or reposed form if it's completely abstracted from the world around us. So here he says, thus the forming of the triangle occurs in the fragments of the triangle being brought into existence by the subject, and in some sense the falsity of the triangle is seen when its parts are present in incompleteness. Fragments which are not yet fully what they are in the form of the triangle, which is the truth. The lines of the triangle isolated from the full shape are in themselves quote unquote false, so to speak, if we consider them to be true in that they are fully what they are meant to be, when in reality they are to be as the triangle. So there is a unity of necessity and contingency within the realm of the geometric proof as well. The proof in itself isn't necessary, it is contingent. We don't have to draw any particular triangle. There are a plethora of triangles we can draw, however, it only becomes necessary if we want to draw the triangle as it is in itself. Hold on, there's a thing here. That is to say, to draw the scalene triangle as scalene, we must follow the rules of its identity so that it is scalene. If not, then we are not drawing it and we're drawing something else. Here, contingency and necessity are one. It is contingently true that this triangle exists, but it is necessarily true that we draw the triangle as a certain triangle for it to be that triangle. Or, this is kind of just what the law of identity is in a way. The necessity is only present when the subject imposes itself to cognize the specific triangle in its particular identity as its identity. In other words, to draw x as x, it must be drawn as x, or else it is not x. This x, however, doesn't have to exist, and it could be another, but this another not as x. So that's sort of like that sort of example I gave there. That is how you could say contingency and necessity are one. Even in contingent things, they are necessarily contingent by their identity. And if they weren't, then they would be necessary. And uh, and I guess you could say like to flip that around. Well, it's contingently true that we recognize this thing as necessary, or it's contingently true that in order for us, well, that would actually be necessarily true. But yeah, I mean, they do imply each other in some sense, basically. So going on, number is dead. Uh, it is not the highest form of knowing because it is an abstraction of substance into the notion. It is the purest sense without accounting for the self moving nature of substance. This number is totally devoid of the essence of substance, negativity. Mathematics is the mere plethora of fixed and inert points that do not necessitate any movement whatsoever. This is because it is separate entirely from substance, which the notion is not. The notion is developed from the encounter of subject with substance. Philosophical science is therefore not interested in mathematical truth, as it has no relation to either substance or subject, as it has made no room for the movement of the negative and is stuck in its entirety within inert picture thought without any relation to substance and subject, which is the reality of our existence, the reality which is moving and not inert. I kind of just went over that before. I don't really think I need to reiterate. You kind of get the point. Um, We can stop at any single assertion of quantity within the spatial field of mathematics, and nonetheless, there is nothing inherently in the number 1 which moves us to 2. However, with notions of substance which are abstracted from the world we live in, there is a real necessity to move beyond the pictured abstraction which already found its origin in the moving world of substance. Hence the reason it can be considered self-moving, since it comes from the domain which was always moving to begin with. Uh, this is, of course, if we're doing reason and we're reasoning with them. But this is once again because mathematics is totally abstracted away in the purest form. And I should also qualify this paragraph before, because you might just say, well, okay, maybe we could say the same thing about number and thinking of things in substance. And in a sense, you can say that because some number being completely reposed is a form of picture thought. Picture thought itself, is picture thought, and to be picture thought is to be reposed. But I think Hegel is saying that with picture thinking, because it ultimately comes from the world of substance, it's a lot easier to see how, well, hold on, wait a second, this thing is incomplete. This thing naturally leads us to this. And that's sort of inherent to the notion that we've abstracted away. Um, you know, I guess let's stick with the apple example. Okay, apples are sweet. Well, okay, that tells me one thing, but well, because they're sweet, they must have sugar in them, and because they have sugar in them, they must be, you know, they must have this effect on the body, and so it's a lot easier to see how these things lead to other things when you take it from the things that are actually moving in themselves. It's a lot easier to move thoughts that come from the world of movement than thoughts that are completely stuck or that don't come from the world of movement or seem completely divorced from it. So moving on from that, this is once again because mathematics is totally abstracted away in the purest form of picture away from the living movement of substance, which is what our reality is, and our reality is not dead mathematical propositions. Mathematics is limited in that it is stuck within the purest form of picture thought. It is solely concerned with paralyzed form, namely numeric unit. Existence is not paralyzed, but rather mobilized. Time, as a counterpart to space, is a self moving notion, but it is to make a mistake to say that the self movement is outside the subject solely within the substance of space. It is negativity which is negating what mathematics has declared to be fixed numeric form. The in itself of mathematics doesn't necessitate movement because its essence is picture. The in itself of the subject is negativity or movement. Hence, why, if it is said that mathematics has more explanatory power than philosophy, it can only be considered to be false, as the reality of the world, our experience, is the real movement of substance and subject, which mathematics doesn't account for. There is nothing inherent in the field of number that necessitates us to move it. This is contrasted with the world of substance and subject, which are in essence always moving and therefore necessarily so. The movement of mathematics occurs from the imposition of the subject, which mathematics doesn't account for either. So, yeah, in mathematics, the subject is completely left out, just like in natural science, the subject is also completely left out. Uh, Therefore, mathematics as well cannot be a complete form of knowing, as knowing it, sorry, let me start again. Therefore, mathematics as well cannot be a complete form of knowing, as it doesn't account for the very thing which is always present in existence, which is the self-moving negativity of the subject. Mathematics devoid of the subject and therefore substance loses its meaning of quantity, which is a product of the subject's externalization into substance and therefore cannot be placed above it. Mathematics is grounded within the absoluteness of spirit, the self movement. As quantity is substance, it is therefore submitted to the unrest of the negative subject and contingent upon it. The question asked, can mathematics be the complete form of knowing more than philosophy? No, because mathematics is ultimately nested within a reality outside itself, which it cannot explain as it is limited by it. The world of inert picture, dead numerics, is limited by the world of evanescence, which it ultimately sits within. Quantity is never truly separable from the quality which it is known through. The absolute subject with its substance reigns supreme over the world of inert picture. Now, moving on, we're going to be moving on to the lifeless understanding. Philosophy
Well,
is,
I think something bears mentioning here. I
yeah,
think mathematics may as well be a stand-in for science as a whole, or
yeah. I mean,
natural science.
ultimately, you kind of like I think
because
it,
he is dealing with the discrepancy he's seeing within the University
yeah,
of Vienna in particular
I think
between
you could
philosophy and
argue.
science.
Yeah, well, you could argue that science is gonna. It ultimately leads to like where mathematics is. Um, it's the logical conclusion in a way. If you're just stuck with these dead pictures of relating substances to substances, but not getting at the essence of what those substances really are, you end up just getting to okay. I mean, what's a logical conclusion? Okay, well, everything is just these different things, these different fields, and then you get to number because now we're just going to take pictures to be absolute truths, and that's what mathematics is. And I think we kind of talked about this last time. I mean, they do like there is kind of a like epistemic horseshoe theory here in a way. Um, if you like if you focus too much on the abstract, you get stuck in picture thought. If you focus too much on substance, you also get stuck in picture thought. If you don't know how to relate those two things, if you don't know how to mediate those two things through thinking them through, you end up in the same place. So I think you're correct. I
But
mean,
Hegel also wants to apply a scientific understanding of philosophy, so he wants to marry the two fields.
yeah, essentially, yeah, he does.
But
Um,
how does he do that then?
that's through dialectical logic. That's speculative philosophy, which I've spoken about before.
Mm.
It's taking the thing in itself and then analyzing it through thinking through its inner contradictions and seeing where it leads. And because logic is in line with reality, it's going to necessitate that you do get somewhere objective, so to speak, like you would in science. Now you could ask, well, okay,
But this
um,
is all accomplished through the imposition of the subject rather than calculation.
well, calculation itself is an imposition of the subject, though.
Oh,
So
okay, sure, sure. So
yeah,
it's okay.
yeah.
So I was wrong to make that distinction. My apologies.
Well,
So
no, I don't think the distinction you were making was incorrect. It's just that calculation is it is like when you're calculating numbers, you're moving numbers. Movement only occurs through the subject, of course. So you know, and that, but that's the limit of mathematics. It doesn't talk about that. It doesn't go outside of yeah. It says oh, you can calculate things, but it never says what is calculating. That's what Hegel's sort of getting at.
it
What
never
is
says what it's calculating.
no? It never says what is calculating.
What?
Like what
Oh,
is
okay.
yeah, like what is doing the process of calculation basically, and that whole process is again proper to negativity, which is absolute subject. So um yeah, but no, the distinction that you're kind of getting at is more or less correct. Both of these things sort of end up in the same place, um which isn't
I
to say
suppose
that
calculation is a faculty of the subject, so it's not the whole
yeah,
subject.
no, it's not the whole subject of yeah, no, it's definitely not. It's but wherever there is movement, there is subject. Is how I think we should look at things here. That's kind of what he's getting at. It's you can sort of think of like almost think of like the essence energy distinction in a way. Like these different expressions of movement, whether it be through mathematical calculation, scientific uh, analysis, even of like moving things, like relating things to one another. Um, those all stem from the essence of movement, and that essence is present in all those things, but it has its origin, if you could call it that. Well, you can call it that, but in the subject basically. um so that's sort of a way to look at it, I think, in maybe like more uh Christian or like Neoplatonic, if you were going to categorize it, if you were going to compare it to something to make it more comprehensible. I think that's what I would do. That's kind of how I viewed it at first. So just moving on here, philosophy as a discipline is concerned solely with the world of actuality. That is to say, the world that we are in just as much as it is in us, subject as substance. The world which is evanescent, ever changing, and negative. Philosophy knows through the world of positive substance, through its negation. When the negative is abstracted as a movement to and from points, it is then what we call the false. The false being the incompleteness of the notion, which is incomplete by virtue of its misalignment with substance, or the reality we are within. This misalignment, which is its incompleteness, is what moves us toward the new notion, which gets us closer to approaching substance in itself, but never can it be so fully. It can never be so fully because the negative as such, which is the absolute, is unapproachable to our cognition, which is always thinking in pictures, which, by virtue of this operation, ultimately misaligns us with substance, as by the time we've conceived of it in a picture, it is moved and conformed to its evanescent self. Thus, because substance is not the absolute in itself, but only so in essence, the absolute negativity is always present in it, moving it and pushing it out of our grasp when we think we've grasped it. This movement is essential, for the truth is not separate from this movement. It is this movement. Particular truth is always being generated by this movement, and truth as such is this movement, as reality set before us, substance is this movement as well, of distinctions. And reality is what we call the true, the appearances of reality that are negated are not in themselves the true. As such, they are incomplete pictures which are subordinate to the whole of truth. Reality, which is evanescence or movement. Thus, it can be said that appearance isn't movement, appearance is subsistent picture, which is subordinate to the whole of truth, which is movement. The various shapes of spirit are negated, and then one is elevated to a higher state of knowing. Their immediacy is negated into the notion, which is then in its identity as a notion, a new immediacy to the subject as knowledge, which is also now a form of existence. For example, you reading these words is an immediate experience, absorbing them and then later reflecting on the words would just be a form of negation of the immediate experience of them into knowledge, which is also a new form of experience as the experience of knowing. So thinking is also knowing just as much as, or rather, thinking is experience just as much as experiencing, the outside world from you is. Um, and I think we all kind of like intuitively know that, right? If that wasn't the case, we couldn't really hold a conversation because you wouldn't be able to think of the words you're using uh, in the moment. You kind of just become like retarded, more or less. Like no, like literally retarded, and not even in like a insulting manner, but like in the true meaning of that word, to be delayed. Uh, so
Kind of like Gert.
yeah, kind of like Gert. Yeah, by the way, I hope nobody thinks that like this picture, this profile picture is actually me. That's just a joke. Uh, I kind of actually regret saying that now. I kind of want people to think that's me. But whatever. So, uh, thus, the whole movement of spirit moves beyond its stages as they are experienced and remembers them in the current stage and so on. The failure and limit of each stage is what pushes spirit out of itself into the next stage until it reaches the realization this process itself is the absolute of it all. And because it's the absolute, this process is inescapable. And that's pushing itself out is that idea of like determinate negation, by the way, in case anybody was confused about that. That's a more simple way of looking at it, I think. The mere knowledge of math can't give us much except dead or static form, pure picture, which remains unmoved by consciousness unless cognized. It is totally impossible to imagine math without it being moved, thus brought into subject and substance, and furthermore, not possible to understand it without its relation to concrete substance as being a quantity of the moving substances. But it, in itself, is static and can't be said to give us much knowledge outside of it. When the triadic form is spoken of, many determinations of a fixed nature, predicates, may be said about it. It has three sides, etc. These predicates can be said to be being for another, or that they all work together to give the triangle its full identity. So that that's just kind of to say that like this side exists, so that way this side exists and that side exists, and all these sides sort of reflect off one another to give the whole shape its form, more or less. If I took one of the sides away from a triangle, it would no longer be a triangle. Uh, so each side has being for another side in a way. It has a relational existence. However, this is ultimately circular and doesn't tell us much about the triangle outside of its identity. We don't know what it is in its essence. We only know its qualities, but not its greater relation and what its basis is in. Much like how science of the natural world can only relate various substances to one another, but never actually get to what's underlying substance as such, the same goes for mathematics. All it can do is relate itself to itself via the subject, but never can it truly tell us what underlies all these distinctions it has made. It can only relate them to one another. It never asks, from where is distinction? The answer is, of course, negativity. The number three is always three of something, and the triadic form can only be brought to life if brought into the subject, which then allows it to be moved and thus negated, which is what the essence of existence is negativity. Lifeless understanding is the understanding which strips substance from itself into picture, which is static form and no longer what reality is, which is why it is always in some sense false, as it is not in line with complete reality. The understanding thinks it captured substance and preserved it, but the picture itself isn't what the reality really is. Therefore, no reality has been preserved whatsoever. Only the form of the notion from the substance experienced in immediacy, which gives us a incomplete insight into what substance is. The scientist who is only concerned with substance or nature and hasn't yet related these things to the subject and therefore absolute spirit takes his knowledge to be greater than it is. The relation of various substances to other substances is what the science of the natural world is. It has its use, it is just limited in knowing. To take this knowledge as the greatest is a sign of an unrefined mind. This is Hegel's words. Uh, it is a mistake as it has failed to relate back to which is underlying it all. The evanescent, the relation of biology, chemistry, physics, etc., is only just relating substance back to substance, but not to the absolute, which is what it's nested within. To take these things as they are in repose form is to once again bring things to the level of picture thought and thus out of tune with ever moving substance. To treat this scientific relation of substances and the knowing of them therein as the highest form of knowing is underdeveloped. It is as if one were to paint all things in a singular color, thinking there are no other colors beyond those to paint it. To think in picture, not to go beyond it, is to suck the life out of reality, which we are in and are of. To highlight this with an image, imagine a skeleton stripped of its flesh and organs, which animate it and make it alive and moving. The lifeless skeleton is the reduction of everything into picture, ushered in by the lifeless understanding, which doesn't account for the real movement of truth that is always generating new appearances through negating others. The true, which is always in immediacy, either in the direct experience of this movement or the experience of the notion in thinking immediacy. Ultimately, the absolute or the excellent, which is what Hegel refers to it as. And by the way, I need to interject here and just say something. This is kind of a side note, but if you ever do read Hegel yourself, which I think if you're watching these videos, you absolutely should. You don't just watch a video and think you're going to know everything, because I'm sure there's things I'm leaving out that I maybe missed. Uh, he's gonna use a lot of poetic language, which is a little annoying because this is already abstract to begin with, and he's making it more abstract. But once you kind of understand the reason he's using that poetic language, it is very beautiful, I would say. Um, so the excellent or the absolute knowing or spirit, which produces all identity via negation, is the own source of its bastardization. Its substance, which it is responsible for externalizing, is what is taken to be true and absolute knowledge and packed away as such in its reposed nature, inanimate and lifeless. Once inanimate and therefore lifeless, it then becomes alienated from the absolute truth, which is in its essence pure animation. The universality of the absolute negative, which generates identity, then becomes used in a superficial way when its substance and appearance is taken to be the absolute, which it is subordinate to. So ultimately, what he's saying is like it's ultimately the fault of the absolute that it's being, that its picture, that its substance is being taken to be more than what it is, because that's how it appears to us. Uh, its appearance is what we're sort of invested within. So it's only natural that we're going to want to call that the absolute when it isn't. Um, and that's just a sort of a bug, I guess you could call it, of the absolute. I mean, a bug for us as understanding subjects, but um, that, that's really the extent of it, I guess. When appearance moves, it becomes part of another and loses its implicit identity in the other. However, prior to its becoming in another, it submerges through the negative void before returning to new determination. The lifeless understanding doesn't recognize this process of moving to and from appearances through the labor of the negative. Rather, it takes appearances as they are and leaves them there, refusing to see the way in which it came to be and where it will go and by how it will go. Because it doesn't recognize this process, all it can do is merely relate fixed substances to another without actually seeing how it is those fixed substances came to be. The understanding, even when it abstracts a property, let's say, quote unquote, causality, it does so as a picture separate from its manifestation in the world of objects to which it is proper. Here, it doesn't tell us much beyond what it's already said to be. Science of the natural world allows for some movement, of course, as it takes the notion from the substance that it has tested and surveyed, but science then allows room for critique and reformulation of the notion as well. However, the science of the natural world is flawed in that in the end, even though it allows for testing and refinement of the notion, it still treats substance as absolute, which it isn't in itself. True science or complete science allows for not only the refinement of the notion, but also recognizes the principle of the negative which brought it into being. Thus, it relates subject and object through the negativity which they share and which they are both a product of. This then is taken back into the negative through the subject and reemerges away from the static picture through being refined by the inner wealth of negativity, which is the wealth that is reality. One thing I will address here is this little area right here where it takes substance to be the absolute, which it isn't. And I know, like we just said before, that well, the substance is this it is one with negativity. It's logically necessary, but what I'm really saying and what he's really saying is like if you're taking substance to be this thing that's a fixed thing that's not moving and that has this pureness to it, this unrelatedness to it, that's wrong. Of course, it's necessary though. That should be said. But it has this ultimate relation to negativity, which is necessary for its existence, and yeah, I mean, kind of what we were talking about before. I just wanted to clear that up in case anybody
But
had.
isn't substance also necessary for negativity's existence?
Yes, it is. Yeah, they're symbiotic.
Hmm.
Um, so because, like I said, like what if negativity is to move? Well, okay, let me say it this way: if negativity's essence is to move, it has to have something to move. If there is substance, there is distinction. If there's distinction, there's negativity. Substance is also defined as this world, this reality that's you know moving to and fro. Of course, it's not just like it isn't a dead thing, even in our experience. So yeah, they necessitate one another basically. But
But isn't there still a hierarchy, or isn't negativity still prior to substance?
well, what do you mean by prior exactly? Because I would okay, I would say it's underlying it. It's a foundation. You could say that, and I think that's
Does it precede substance?
not in any temporal manner because that already presupposes its existence. So that would be like circular, but it's I would say it's logically posterior perhaps, but also like it is the foundation of substance for sure. It's more universal than any particular substances. That's also for
So you could say that well, to use like a theological term from the Trinity, you could say that negativity begets substance,
correct. Yeah, but and it's also
atemporally within eternity.
yes, yeah, I
Yeah,
would say yeah. That'd be I think that's a
but
accurate
but substance nonetheless, it originates within negativity or subject.
yeah, logically speaking, yes.
Hmm.
Um and yeah, so there is like a sort of if you look at it this way, right? If you look at it from the standpoint of subject, yes, it is necessary that we need negativity for it. Now, if you look at it the other way, it's also the case. Like it's like there are two sides of the same coin, but they are in the end one coin, and that one coin has one common universal all throughout it, which is negativity. So in that sense, it is foundational. It is prior. You could
So
say that.
if we were to go a step further, it would mean that negativity or absolute spirit or subject or whatever you want to call it, it is unoriginated.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, um,
It
because
it
it's
is it is I don't know. There doesn't need to be like a reference. It doesn't need a reference point necessarily,
correct.
or
Yeah.
like
Well, it is an absolute, right? And so the absolute is self-contained.
yeah.
So it is in his work, it is self-contained as well. Um, so, and I'm sure as we go through this, we're going to see more of, you know, of this being laid out when we come to the
But I
next.
mean, like I don't know. It's still like the fact that substance is still necessary for negativity to exist. Um, that's a little bit of a paradox, isn't it?
No, yeah,
If
it's a par-
negativity is it doesn't if it is self-contained, if it's unoriginate,
yeah.
unoriginate, that would imply that it doesn't need substance necessarily. But we've
Well,
already established that it does.
yeah, but the thing is, it would be proper to its essence, just like an eternal creator. Its essence is to eternally create. Um, and that is part like it's part of its unoriginate nature, I guess, is what he would say. Um,
Okay.
so yeah, basically that. So all this occurs from the abstraction of substance into notion or self identity, which subsists. This subsistence isn't the subsistence of substance because substance doesn't subsist, it is always moving. But it is the abstraction of itself from itself, or the subject abstracting substance into notion. But as substance and subject are one, it is itself taking from itself. True science recognizes that it ought not to follow the dogma of reposed assurance of mere appearance, but that it must recognize these appearances are to be gated and moved, all belonging to the whole. The universal has its own substance and moments which are reflected inwardly, which is the work of its essence, through substance which is necessary for it to know itself and to operate, but is necessary in its subordination to that universal as well. Thus they are needed for one another, but substance taken to be more than what it is incorrect. The particular can exist without the particular can't exist without its universal grounding. The universal can't exist without its particular to be particular, to be a particular of. That universal is not a static being, but the negative in itself, through which it operates in its negation of its own substance, particulars, into its essence, negativity, which is its origin, yet atemporally, just like the foundation of the house is always there as it is a necessary grounding, yet without the house, it's not grounding anything. Knowing this is the highest form of science and knowing. That's kind of what we kind of talked about all that already. So here, this is a little bit more of a clarification that I kind of want to go through again. Hegel's issue with natural science is that it only relates substance to itself, but never subject, and in turn, greater absolute reality that is nested within. Because of this, it leaves us with pictures of substance referring and relating to other pictures. It is a starting point in knowing, but it is limited. Hegel's issue with mathematics is similar. It relates abstract images to other abstract images, which don't give us any true knowledge unless subjectivity moves these abstractions into the world to know it and then back into itself. In some sense, you can see science and math as being two sides of the same limited knowing. Science totally stuck within substance, absent to subject, therefore to absolute reality, and mathematics totally stuck within the abstract and not relating back to mind, in which its movement can occur through substance. One is abstract and one is concrete, but both produce dead image, unmoved, and taken to be true, ultimately divorcing them from the evanescent nature of reality, negativity, or movement. The highly abstract image taken to be full truth is equal in its repose to the concrete image produced from substance. We kind of just spoke about that before. This is also important. I added this later on, defining the notion, uh, which I kind of talked about last time, but it's a little bit laid out more rigorously here. And this is also extremely important. It's going to be important through the rest of the whole book. So it's important to get this down as well. The notion as such is not an idea external to the subject. The notion is the subject, which is why it is self moving, because the notion is the wholeness of truth, the wholeness that manifests itself in smaller notions or particulars, like smaller just ideas, uh, in which its essence as absolute notion is present. It is where subject and object are one with each other, and the notion which is alive in the subject moves through the thinking process through expressing itself in particular notions proper uh, to the whole, which, because they are proper to the whole or absolute notion, they return back to the notion when they are fully moved through. Since the truth is self-generating and moving as nothing else outside the truth can move, it is because then it wouldn't be the truth. It is then this movement of itself for itself that is the movement of the notion. Reality manifesting itself through concepts to then come to understand itself as a whole, finding where the concepts lead from their inner identity outward. The whole of truth, which is reality, manifesting itself into particulars through which it comes to know itself through them in the thinking subject, which has for its essence the movement of thought, which is the movement of reality or the notion. Hence, we can say the notion is intrinsically linked to subject. It is not external to it, but it is always present within it, within it in immediacy, since to be conscious is to be aware of reality, of some kind of reality, and that is a notion itself acting in symbiosis with the thinking subject. The subject itself can't be separate from thought and immediacy, much like a living body is defined by its organs, can't be so without it. The content of the body is intrinsic to it. The content of the subject, which is its reality, is the notion. Hence, why it is said to be self moving, since the moving is occurring within the one reality and not from outside it, the reality being the absolute evanescent subject. Thus, form and content are one. The subject is in its own substance. That is why it moves itself, as there is no externality within reality as such, uh, which is why that movement, much like the content of the body, is the body as such. The living body is moving itself from within itself. The notion is moving itself from within itself through its manifestation in the thinking subject, it, which knows it through its other manifestation within substance, which circles back into a holistic reality, which we find to be the negative movement as such, or the absolute. The movement of the subject is the movement of substance, which is the movement of the notion, the reality underlying it all as the absolute negative. Now, of course, you can't picture the absolute negative in itself. It's going to be flawed. Uh, it's contrary to its essence to try and picture it in itself. But
Yeah, so I just figured out a very, very simple way to grasp this, how the notion is formed. So it's like a Venn diagram. So imagine the subject is one circle, the object is the other circle, and the notion is simply where the two circles overlap.
perfect. That's a perfect
Very
way of
simple
putting
way
it.
of explaining it.
Yeah, that's perfect. Uh,
And of course, the notion in the middle is the circulation between the
the
two
two.
circles as well.
Yeah, exactly. It's you know like notion itself in other translations has been translated as comprehending. I hate to say this because I don't want to sound like a hippie chick, but I'm sure we've all heard, "Oh man, we're the universe experiencing itself." Hegel is kind of saying that, but he's saying that in a much in a much more rigorous manner, and he's making distinctions, ontological distinctions when he's saying that, and there are real categories that matter. Of course, the hippie chick, smoking some cheap weed pen and drinking matcha isn't doing that, but they're not. There is a relation there, I should say. But anyway, we're kind of getting towards the end here almost. The humility of knowing absolutely. So the notion has its own identity from which we start. It has its fixed identity, but because it is fixed, it is flawed. It is flawed because the notion is a one sided construct. This is notion with a small n, by the way. Uh, is a one sided construct of the understanding subject, which makes it incomplete. It is incomplete in the sense that because it is abstracted from substance and substance is evanescent, the notion has only ever captured a partial aspect. This notion, in its nature, as all things are, has negativity and self othering. It has its own distinct identity, and by virtue of this distinct identity, it is what it is, and also is not another. Once again, X is X and not X. This limitation within, which is a product of its incompleteness, which in a sense makes it false, is what pushes it to move beyond itself. Once this incompleteness is realized by the subject, which is negating it through speculative thinking, which recognizes this discrepancy. And the reason I bring up that X example is because I'm trying to drive home the point that even in something as simple as a letter, um, negativity is still present, self othering is still present. Um, and that gets more complex when you get to idea, for example. Uh, so all of this occurs by substance making itself into determinate form, which then the knowing subject abstracts into the form of the notion for which it knows substance through from herein. It then moves the notion beyond its determinate form, which, in its incompleteness, recognized by the speculative subject, moves beyond itself into a new. This is, of course, the subject coming to itself through this process, as we have mentioned hitherto. It abstracts itself from its own self, own negative movement, relates it back to its evanescent self as substance, which then leads it to a higher understanding of itself, eventually knowing the underlying nature of this. Uh, all has been that movement of the negative itself. The subject, in its speculative thought, which is negativity, realizes that the notion doesn't align with the moving nature of substance. Once this occurs, the notion is then taken to its logical conclusion, which it recognizes. When it recognizes this disparity between the dead picture of the notion and the movement of substance, the notion in its incomplete nature is then exposed in its inadequacy, which is moved beyond the speculative process. This can be said to be proper to the notion as the notion is integral to the speculative process, hence its quote unquote determinate negation. The negation only doesn't occur when the process of true speculation isn't occurring, which is to be stuck within picture thinking, the milieu of static appearance. Speculative thinking, due to its rigor, is rare. Most people don't have the discipline to do so, most of all, the courage. When the subject's notion is taken to be absolute, thus a picture is met by the negative either through another subject or accidental realization. He resists this negating of the notion as some alien force thrust upon it and not inherent to the notion. However, with time and when cognitive and emotional maturation has set in, this new way of looking at the matter at hand is accepted with what one may call revolutionary fervor and excitement. This is an interesting idea. He's kind of making a sociological point to think. Okay, so we all have ideas, right? We get attached to our ideas. To think through our ideas sort of feels threatening because it sort of threatens the stability of our knowing. It makes us realize, oh, we actually didn't know this, and our knowledge wasn't as secure as we thought it was. But with time, we start to come to accept these things, and then when we do, we sort of parade it as if we're excited to know the truth all along. When in reality, if we look at it, we were pretty hesitant to do so at first. I think a lot of people are like this with ideology. Actually, it's kind of a really good example. Like the libertarian to alt right pipeline is real, and a lot of people like report having initial resistance to alt right ideas before they adopt them. But then when they adopt them, there's no going back really, and they sort of see it as like, oh, I'm so happy to know this. I've been waiting to do this all along, which is in some sense true, but in another sense, well, like at the time you were coping more or less why they were false. So that's a concrete example you could use to sort of understand what he's saying. I think, and that applies to every other idea as well in philosophy, everything, science too. That's why science isn't unbiased as people make it out to be. There's cliques in science that are not willing to actually be scientific. So, philosophical science must be rigorous when dealing with the notion. It must understand the notion as such and its determinations, such as its being in itself, being for self and self identity, or its existence as such. Its being for the subject and existence as its identity and not another, or else it wouldn't be it. To know this is to know its nature as self moving within the subject. Negativity is implied within its distinct nature. Negativity likewise is implied within being for the subject as notion, which is how it is moved through speculation within the subject. Finally, its self identity is implied, being contrasted with otherness that it also has within its identity, implicit to itself. Distinct from the first, which is what it is as such, and unrelated, whereas self identity is implied being mediated through relation to what it is not. Thinking in a way of too much fluidity or being stuck in the world of immanence, leads to a lack of true knowing, since it cannot be grasped. But likewise, thinking in the way of pure abstraction, taken to its extreme, leads to dead picture thinking too far away from substance, and it becomes unrelated to the world we find ourselves within. Therefore, it must be mediated through the dialectical process of knowing, which is the negation of the notion until its fullness is revealed. And this kind of goes right back into what you were saying before us now about like that uh, sort of diagram, but also just how like Hegel himself is trying to marry these disciplines into a larger sort of system. It's absolutely what he's doing here, um, and that's why this is a major part of the preface because he's sort of explaining what he's doing before we actually go into like the nitty gritty of all of it. Um,
Yeah, I just want to make a brief statement on the very
yeah,
last
go ahead.
part of the previous paragraph to this one. How, when cognitive and emotional maturation has set in and this new way of looking at the matter at hand is accepted with what one may call revolutionary fervor and excitement, whereas before you saw the imposition of the way of looking at the matter of hand, something that's alien outside of you. So there was a resistance because you see it as a, I don't know, as unnecessary or laborious to think
Yeah,
about or a threat or whatever. Well, for everyone listening right now to this podcast, whether you're paying attention or consuming it passively, I guess I want you to think about where you are in relation to what we're talking about here. So, do you feel like you're repelled, or do you feel like maybe you can't really be bothered to engage with the content? And let me tell you, I was where you are right now, if that's the case, because when Gabriel first started putting out his stories on Instagram about Hegel, I just didn't want to pay attention because it was too much. It was walls of text. But then he got in touch with me and say, "Well, okay, do you want to do this podcast with me? Like, do you want to, like read the preface to the phenomenology of spirit with me?" That was, like a personal encounter. So I said, why not? Let's go through it. And at first I had some difficulty, but then I started with negativity and other foundational concepts, and gradually I started understanding, and eventually I started realizing that there's actually something here, that I should tarry with this, that I should maybe stick with this and maybe learn something that can be applied to reality. And the more we talked about like the relation to reality as well, the more I found it to be fruitful.
yeah,
So you
yeah,
just got to have a little bit of patience. You got to have a little bit of attention, and what you're listening to right now eventually will pay off in some way, because there isn't really such a thing as bad philosophy. If it is indeed philosophy, if philosophia, the love of wisdom, there's no such thing as bad philosophy, because you are trying to look for something, some kind of way to explain the world around us, or you know, the way
yeah.
you are, the way things are.
And I'm really happy you said that because it's 100% correct. Even when I first like I read this whole book. Just in case the audience doesn't know, I went through the whole book. A year ago. I started in, well, more like December 2024, and then I finished in July. And I was going at like 10 pages at a time. Took it very slowly. I watched lectures to help me understand. I wasn't just doing this in a vacuum. It took a lot of work. I also read this book in a rather chaotic environment at the time, to put it
Yeah,
shortly.
we don't need to
Yeah,
go into the
yeah.
details of that.
But so so it was really hard to get through. But I was like, I know there's something here. The reason I know there is something here is because there's tons of people referencing this work throughout history and other philosophers. So they've got something from it. They all seem to get something similar from it. And I'm not gonna give up. And I'm glad I did it because it's one of those texts you come back to and you just get more out of every time you think about it. And it's kind of funny because uh, when you when you read Hegel, especially the preface, the act of reading it, he's describing what you're doing as you're reading it. It's kind of surreal in a way. Like just this paragraph here, to use a small example. Excuse me. Okay, we're moving through these ideas, we're relating all these ideas, we're seeing where one leads to the other. He's forcing us to do the dialectical process. He's forcing us to do the dialectical process through explaining what the dialectical process is. That's what when I realized that, it was sort of like holy truth nuke or something.
Hmm.
And I was like, well, okay, I can't really refute him though. Even if I wanted to here, because I'd have to use his system, and if I'm using his system, I'm assuming it has verity or something. So that was really interesting to me. And Snout had mentioned, like, him and I had a private discussion off air, um, and we discussed. He asked me, how do you use this in real life? How's this making you money? He didn't ask that. That's something my dad would ask.
That's something your dad would ask, not me.
He totally would. So well, I said to him, I said, well, once I understood what negativity was, what real speculative thought was, which is to take something itself, see where it's limited, like investigate the idea, um, and then I see it's a problem, or if I can find a problem with it, I then get a clearer picture of reality through doing that. And I don't remember exactly what example I used, but I think if I can remember, I said something along the lines of, like, if somebody were to give you advice, you could then take that advice and you say, well, okay, I can see why that's true in some sense. I'll just use a really cliche example. Treat others the way you want to be treated. Okay, I kind of agree to that on the surface, but let me really think about that for a minute here. Well, what if I'm like a sadomasochist? What if I
Mm.
love getting like my face punched or something like weird like that? What if I'm like mentally disturbed? Well, okay, if that was the case and I followed the principle, treat everybody as you want to be treated, I would go around assaulting people by my own logic. So we see that that idea is sort of flawed in a way. And how did I figure out that idea was flawed? I didn't reference an external idea. I took that idea itself. I said, okay, let me take this. Let me see where this goes if I play it out. Oh, it leads
Yeah,
to
well, I mean that in itself, treat people as you want to be treated. That is an imperfect colloquial form of the original biblical commandment from Christ, which is love others as yourself, or love your neighbor as yourself,
yeah.
which is that's more clear and
Uh-huh.
less ambiguous
Yeah,
than treat others as you want to be treated. Because,
exactly.
like you said, yeah, you might want to hurt yourself.
Yeah, exactly. It's so, like, that's like an example, and there's and this is interesting, because negativity is universal, and that means it's in everything. It's in every particular. That system of embracing the negative, of like surfing it, if you will. Um, if you know how to do that, you can really know how to reason your way through anything. And that's why I said last time, I said Hegel, people call Hegel the last philosopher, not because he's answered every philosophical question. He's not claiming to know it, like he's not claiming to be omniscient or something like that. But he's provided the system in which all knowing, true knowing can occur. He's outlined that for us. He said, if there is true knowing, which there is, because to say there isn't is a self contradiction. It's going to occur in this system, because this is the system that reflects reality the most, and every other system doesn't reflect reality the most. And I can prove that to you through showing what happens if you try to refute the system, if you presuppose it. So that's why he's sort of the last philosophy, because he's it's almost like, to use a weird analogy, maybe, he's created the football stadium in which real football games can occur. Um, to put it in like a physical image for you. And that's how I would view it. He says, well, okay, here are the rules of the game. This is how the game works. If you're going to play the game and you're going to play it right, you have to play it this way. If you're not playing it right, eventually you're not playing the game. I put out a tweet the other day saying that to do something is to do it correctly. The less correct you do it, the less you are doing that thing, the further away you're getting from its essence. So, for example, to ride a bike, okay, well, to ride a bike is to ride it correctly. You have to sit on it. You have to pedal the wheels. If you do it incorrectly, let's say you pedal one wheel, you do it even more incorrectly. Now you're not pedaling any wheels. You do it even more incorrectly. You're putting your head on the seat, and you're doing a handstand on the seat. Okay, you're not riding a bike anymore. You're doing something else, but you're not riding a bike. Same thing applies to philosophy. Uh, that being said, where do we? I think we left off on the last paragraph, right?
Let's see here. Um,
Yeah, I think we did.
did we?
Yes, yeah, we did, because I do remember
Yeah.
reading this
Okay.
before.
Go on.
Uh, The understanding likes to negate, but takes delight in doing so without positing. This is a reflection into its own vanity and is a destructive negative and not a constructive negative, which is what the negative really is. There is there it is pure vanity and inwardness, and divorce from it is real movement. Pure negative thinking doesn't seek the necessary positive that the negative produced in its negation of the positive hitherto. Rather, it thinks it has escaped the system of negativity by simply saying, quote, it is all wrong and to be moved beyond in every case. However, this is not how speculative philosophy or thinking works. Speculative thinking realizes that there is negativity, but this negativity exists in symbiosis with positivity as such. Like ultimately, epistemology is not divorced from metaphysics. So his metaphysical, maybe you don't want to call it a metaphysical system. I would call it a metaphysical system because I would, I, I think a better definition of that than other people do. It's not my definition, but anyway, um, ultimately the way reality is, the essence of reality isn't divorced from knowing. That's essential here. As to be negated, it must be the positive, which is that undergoing negation. And if negation is taken as universal and for its essence as negation and its inner necessity, it must have something to universally negate, which is that positivity. In other words, this positive is just as universal as the negative needs the positive in order to conform to its essence as a negative which negates. Hegel, however, focuses on the negative as it is often overlooked in favor of positive determinations, which are falsely perceived as static pictures separate from their underlying reality of negativity. I think that also kind of qualifies a little bit more to your question before us now about why he's putting so much emphasis on the negative. And I think it's also just because it's kind of just it's been left unexplored, and I think that's also part of the reason he wants to really dig into what that is as well. Because he seems to be like the first philosopher that I know to really well, okay, Heraclitus does, but in, in a more rigorous manner, of course. Hegel then introduces the grammatical relation of
Well,
subject
hold
predicate.
on, hold on. About Heraclitus, it should be said that most of what we know about Heraclitus comes from others that wrote, like, basically excerpts from his own works within the works of other philosophers. I think the only work that um, I mean that we can attribute to Heraclitus, purely to Heraclitus, is his fragments, which is obviously like a collation of different
Right.
things which were quoted in the works of other philosophers. So like we don't really have a complete corpus of any one of Heraclitus's works. We just know like some statements that he's made or like some of his axioms or whatever.
That kind of reminds me that like this is sort of similar but not completely similar. Like Origen, the Christian theologian, like that he is a good source. Like even if you just put his theology aside, he's just a good source for like verifying the Old Testament because he references it so many times that it like these it shows that these references match up. Um, I don't know.
Yeah,
Just
well, to go back to Heraclitus, Heraclitus could have been the ancient Hegel,
oh, I think he
and
probably
all of his
was.
writings would have been obviously are just lost to time, or most of his writings.
Yeah,
So
and
we
that's
don't really know like how much knowledge is, or like what knowledge has been lost
yeah.
since antiquity.
That that reminds me because there is so on the right there's like this Platonic Nietzsche. There's the Platonic right and the Nietzschean right. The Platonic right I feel like kind of died out. The Nietzschean right is sort of at the forefront at the moment. You see it everywhere. And I wanted part of the reason I wanted to do this project as a right winger is I wanted to introduce Hegel again to the right. Historically there has been right Hegelians,
Mm.
and the left has in their philosophy they also have a Nietzschean element, like directly a Nietzschean element. I mean, with postmodernism, but also a Hegelian element. They've been able to synthesize the two in a sense, and I think we should do the same thing. And that's another project for another time that I'll get into with perhaps the warrior philosopher who's a Nietzschean that I actually respect. I know a lot of people might see me shit on Nietzscheans a lot, but it's only Nietzsche slop accounts that I really don't like. If you're a Nietzschean and you have like and you're building a system from that, I can respect that because you put in work to create something beyond the just quotes, for example. And I think that's anyone who does anything like that is worth respecting, in my opinion. But
Hopefully, we can have him on at some point in the future.
Yeah. No, I definitely think so. I mean, like Deleuze is he just read Deleuze and he was talking about that a little bit. And Deleuze, I want to get into Deleuze because he's an anti-Hegelian, so it would be nice to have a sort of different perspective uh, later down the line. I think that might be
And
valuable.
we all know that every anti-Hegelian is unconsciously Hegelian.
Yeah, I kind of have like premature criticisms that I've thought to myself, but we won't get too off track with that. We only got a couple pages here left, so we'll
You
just
see,
kind of
everyone's a Hegelian because Hegelianism is true.
yeah, exactly. It's
Very, very.
inescapable. Hegel's doing kind of like a Chad movie. She's like, well, but I define my system as inescapable, so you can't escape. It's really
Yes.
funny. So it's like actually, yeah, I define myself as not wrong, so I don't really know what to tell you. Um,
If you've been listening to us for an hour and a half, that's just proof. You just can't escape this.
yeah,
Something pulls you in and you just can't let go. You just can't stop listening to this. Why are
yeah.
you still listening to this? It's because you have to listen to this because it's inescapable.
Actually, that being said, I do really, if anyone is still watching after, this is going to be longer than the first one, and then when I have to go back and put the sections in, I'm going to be really annoyed. But if you're still watching, I do appreciate it. I commend your patience. It's very rare today. It's seldom found, as they say. Anyway, going through here, Hegel then. Oh, so this. Before, let me preface this real quick. This was really hard to get through this section, not because what he's saying is hard, but because he didn't tell you he was making a subject predicate distinction in a grammatical sense. But ultimately, what applies to subject predicate in a grammatical sense does apply to subject object or subject substance distinction as well. So I want you to keep that in mind when we go through.
So could you give a concrete example of the grammatical relation of subject predicate?
Like just in general, or in
Yeah.
okay, so like there is Gabriel Sprock. Gabriel Sprock is a YouTuber. So subject is Gabriel Sprock, predicate is YouTuber.
Mm.
Uh, it's sort of it's what you can say about the subject.
Hmm. Hmm.
So Hegel then introduces the grammatical relation of subject, predicate, or accident. Although it should be mentioned that this distinction here and what he outlines also applies to the subject in the sense of consciousness, is that too is a subject in a grammatical context as well. Yeah, and anytime we say like the subject has object, like that sentence itself also is like it's a meta subject in a way. Um, so or it is the subject content of this work, which things are predicated upon. Furthermore, accident, as it is accident, is a contingent property of a subject, or it's a predicate that just has a contingent nature. Some predicates can be, well, I get to that right here. Actually, I'll just read it. Now, all accidents are predicates, but not all predicates are accidents. Some predications of a subject must be necessary for its being in itself. For example, John is John. This predicate here, John, this predicate is necessary to the subject. It's just the law of identity. Once again, however, the predicate young in the sentence, John is young, is not necessary, even if true. John may be young, but this is a contingent reality, and he doesn't have to be young necessarily for him to be John. Now, for him to be young John, yes, he has to be young John. That's where contingency becomes necessity in that case, because then you're realizing the identity, the law of identity manifests itself there. But for John to be John as such, you know, he doesn't necessarily have to be young, right? We all know this. It's pretty basic. Uh, in the subject predicate relation, we have the issue of these predicates of the subject appearing to be surface level attributes of a subject that is implied to be inert. Many predicates and accidents are proclaimed of this subject. Picture thinking here is what is occurring where the relation of various predicates are related back to a inert subject, both being equally fixed and both subject predicate not being analyzed further than the relation to one another on the surface of their appearance as such. This is the same issue with scientific thinking of just relating one or more objects to another without exploring the deeper inner truths of how those relate back to the high reality in which they are grounded within, negativity. When speculative thinking is applied, and when the grammatical subject is explored beyond its mere appearance, we see that the subject has externalized itself through its predicates. Here, then, the subject dissolves away into the form of the predicate, which for self consciousness becomes the new subject in the subject predicate relation, which then can be predicated of, and thus the process continues. It becomes an object for self, the content of which is the grammatical subject. The inert subject is only taken to be inert by the consciousness which utilizes its picture as the basis through which the thinking process occurs. It can be said that the externalization of substance is what is univocally the predicate of the subject in the grammatical relation, just as much as it is in the subject-substance relation mentioned earlier in earlier parts. So that was a lot, but a simple way to put it is, okay, you
Let's
know,
start from Gabriel Sprock as a YouTuber.
that's yeah. I was just going to use that because we'll keep the same example. Gabriel Sprock is a YouTuber. Gabriel Sprock, subject, predicate, YouTuber. Now, then the thinking subject may say, okay, well, what is a YouTuber? Well, a YouTuber is someone who makes videos on a website called YouTube. Okay, now we see here the subject has become YouTuber when in the original setting, in the original formulation, it was predicate.
But now we know what a YouTuber is. So what kind of YouTuber are you? What
Well,
videos do you put out?
right, exactly. And then and now see, you're hitting on something really, really important there. You're doing the speculative process, and here's where I need to point this out because if this isn't mentioned, the whole thing falls apart. You're keeping Gabriel Sprock present within that reasoning process. So ultimately, the predicates, which become subjects, which then have their predicates, which then become subjects themselves, are related back to the original subject, which is Gabriel Sprock. This process itself in language is speculative thinking manifest, so to speak. And that's why this is the most difficult part because he's just saying this is what philosophy is in a grammatical sense. This is what it looks like. So what you just outlined there is precisely the dialectical process. And notice you didn't start by relating predicates back to the subject uh, just in a sort of lazy manner. What you did there was you dive deeper into the predicate, made it a subject, and they kept doing that. That's speculative reasoning. If you were to say Gabriel Sprock is a YouTuber, he makes videos, that wouldn't really tell us much. That would say something, but it wouldn't really get to the heart of the matter. But if you say Gabriel Sprock is a YouTuber, and a YouTuber is someone who makes videos, and Gabriel Sprock makes videos on politics and philosophy, and politics is this and philosophy is that, okay, all of that started from the prime subject in the reasoning process. It started from there and it moved from there. You weren't relating concepts. I mean, yes, there were concepts outside of Gabriel Sprock in predicate, but you kept it related to the subject the whole time. That's the essence of speculative thinking. And he's going to go on to he's going to try and distinguish this from what may be confused to be speculative thinking, the ratiocinative form of thought, and we're going to get into that in a minute here.
Ratiocinative meaning scientific, mathematical, so
Well,
on.
yes. I mean, those are both ratiocinative forms of thought, but there's also abstract forms of thought, like philosophical forms of thought, which are ratiocinative.
Mm.
You know, like what would be called casual philosophy. I'm trying to think of an example of this. Um, maybe maybe somebody who just says, "Oh, well, this is the world. The world is full of a bunch of evil people. People are evil. You shouldn't trust anybody." Um, you know, that is like well, all I'm doing there is I'm just taking a bunch of predicates. I'm relating them back to each other, but I'm not actually getting to what those predicates are. Like I never asked, "What is evil? What is a person? What does it mean for a person to be evil? How are these things related? How are these things not related?" Um,
Would you say this is a feature of analytic philosophy?
Um, yeah, it can be. I think it can be actually. Not all analytic philosophy, but a lot of times analytic philosophy kind of presupposes the concepts which it's working with. It doesn't go beyond uh, what that is. I mean, like logical positivism, it collapsed when Kurt Gödel said, well, this is what happens if we take this to its conclusion. You can't justify the system from within itself because that would be circular and that's invalid reasoning by the laws of logic. If you try to contradict the laws of logic, of course, that itself falls into a problem because it presupposes the laws of logic to contradict them. So that's why Kurt Gödel single-handedly, to use Zoomer speak, one-shotted the positivist movement because they were working with preconceived notions of what reality was. They never actually dug into those presuppositions. They never sort of dug underneath them. You see this kind of stuff all the time with the new atheist movement, where they're like, "Oh, Christians are evil and atheists are more moral." Right? That's a common. That was all the rage back in the day. Now, okay, whatever. I mean, that comment is neither here nor there, but all that presupposes that you know what evil is. Uh, you know, you have a way to justify what evil is, or the existence of evil. You have its opposite in mind as well, like that. The like amazing atheist types, these like Reddit philosophy types, they're not speculative thinkers. They're just merely relating concepts that they assume we all share the same notion of. Now, I hate to be that guy, but when Jordan Peterson says, well, what do you mean by God, right? uh it's not a horrible question. I mean, it's annoying because he knows what we mean when we say that, when we ask that question, and he just doesn't want to answer it directly because he doesn't want to alienate part of his demographic fan base. That's why it's sort of detestable. But like asking that question in a purely philosophical sense is actually a good question. I mean, that's what theologians do. That's what theology is. It's the philosophy of religion. But so that's just to kind of give an example, like the age-old Christian versus atheist debate. Back in 2011, YouTube, Richard Dawkins, all these people, they're coming to the table to argue philosophy with these presuppositions that they never actually questioned, they never actually investigated.
I would
Um,
say that theology isn't quite the philosophy of religion because theology implies some sort of doctrine, which is fixed,
sure,
and
sure, but
philosophy relies on inquiry, right? But of course, you can apply philosophy to theology. So there's
yeah,
philosophy of theology. You can sort
yeah.
of
Well, sorry, did I?
rationalize theology through philosophy.
Yeah. Well, that did I say theology of philosophy? I meant to say it the
You
other way.
said that theology is philosophy of religion.
Yeah, I think I did say that. Yeah. I mean, what
So
I'm saying is like it's philosophy. What I meant to say is that it's in it being philosophy of religion. It's like philosophy applied to religion. That's what I originally meant. Um, like, and the reason, like for example, like we see like Greek Platonic language used throughout, early theologians in the church. And some people misunderstand that, of course, but and they think that's like injecting Platonism into Christianity or something. But that's not what that is, of course. It's, taking these concepts within theology and rationalizing them, or understanding them through a sort of method that can, you know, give us truth. That's what I was saying. If that was sort of misunderstood, I don't know if that's the same thing you meant, but
I
um,
guess we don't need to dwell on it. It's just
okay,
a little aside thing.
yeah, I guess it was a semantic difference. Ultimately, I don't think the order of words there um, made a huge difference. But
That's fine. We
yeah,
could we can go back to Hegel.
where was I now?
We're actually past 1 hour and 30 minutes. We're at 1:47,
Yeah, but
and
I think
you
we should
said
just
you
go.
wanted to keep it under 2 hours.
Yeah, but for this, we have like 4 pages left. So
Sure. Okay.
yeah,
Then let's
and
just finish this.
yeah, I'm just trying to remember where I was. Was I?
So when speculative thinking is applied,
Oh yeah,
blah 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 blah. You finished
when
that.
speculative thinking is applied and when the grammatical subject is explored beyond its mere appearance, we see that the subject has externalized itself through its predicates. Here, then, the subject dissolves away into the form of the predicate, which for self consciousness becomes a new subject in the subject predicate relation, which then can be predicated of, and thus the process continues. It becomes an object for self, the content of which is the grammatical subject. The inert subject is only taken to be inert by the consciousness, which utilizes it. Oh, I think I did read this already, but
Yeah,
okay.
that's what I meant.
Yeah.
You read this.
Okay. Through the unraveling of the predicate beyond its appearance, we come to know the grammatical subject, just as through the unraveling movement of substance, through which thinking occurs to guide its thought, we come to know the nature of spirit as such. Implied within the predicate's self-identity is the grammatical subject. Within the predicate, the inner meaning of the subject is revealed, thus what we call its substance. The way in which subject works exists is unknown. It is known through its existence and submergence through predicate. To know this is to think dialectically. This thought process, which is true knowing, should be distinguished from two other forms of thought, namely picture thinking, which is merely relating appearances and fixed abstractions, which we just went over, without taking them through a rigorous examination. Secondly, the purely argumentative or ratiocinative, which exists merely to negate, but not see the positive necessity implied through that
Positivity.
well, to not see the positivity necessarily implied through that negation. The difference between the former and the latter is that the former doesn't call into question the verity of the abstractions, and the latter calls into question the verity, but doesn't go beyond that. It merely doubts and thinks this is good enough and can't bring itself to ask, if not this, then what? Solely just not this. And that, I mean, that is true, but you could there are also people who do posit things, but they posit things without actually analyzing the things that they were positing before. That's also problematic. Trouble comes when the thinking subject conflates dialectical thinking with that of ratiocinative. To think dialectically is not to just refute the notion from the outside, but instead to refute it on the basis of its inner faults, and from here move on to a new perspective which replaces what it is lacking. The inadequacy here then moves thought, and this is what it means to think, beyond its repose back into the notion once more. To illustrate this relation further, Hegel uses the relation of meter and accent, a musical relation. This is compared to the relation of subject and predicate, which is nested within the form of a proposition, a sentence that expresses the notion idea. The movement here is from subject to predicate, where the subject becomes lost within the predicate, but then through knowing that it is a predicate of the subject and proper to it, it then returns back to it. And that goes back to that example we used before. The subject is thus lost once the focus is on the predicate, but then reappears once it is related back. This dissolution of the subject into predicate form is part of the harmony that is the notion. The idea which moves similarly in music, the movement between accent and meter is rhythm. This movement from accent, where each instance dies away into the new until the rhythm is complete, is equivalent to the grammatical subject dissolving itself into the predicate, which is its substance by the movement of the notion, which in this case would be the rhythm in music, until it's been fully worked out harmoniously and the notion has worked out the truth underlying the grammatical subject. So basically, yeah, the rhythm is this movement of accent and meter, and and that itself is the whole rhythm. And knowing is the rhythm of the movement of subject through predicate back to subject. It's that
And
whole.
subject is the notes.
Well, I guess the subject would be, yeah, accent, and then predicate would be, um, what's moving it, right? Because the predicate is proper to subject, and then like the subject dies away in the predicate and then comes back, just like the accent dies away and then
But
comes
we are
back.
talking about music, right?
Yeah, well, he's just like, so he's using that just as like an image for us to understand. And I guess in its nature of being an image, of course, it's imperfect, but it just sort of puts things into perspective. It's I think it's not necessary to relate it to that, but I put it in there
Yeah,
because it.
yes. So I just wanted to go over something. So
Yeah.
by this point, predicate has replaced substance.
No, it's replaced. Oh, okay. You mean just like in this grammatical? Yes,
Before we were talking about subject and substance. Now we're talking
yes.
about subject and predicate.
No, you're correct. That's
So
correct.
predicate has become a stand-in for the same thing, which is substance.
Yes, exactly.
Mhm.
Um, and like
But
the
now
reason,
we're like, it's more grammatical. It's
yeah,
more lingual rather
and
than.
because that whole relation of subject substance is universal because of the negativity, it equally applies to this just as much as it does that. So at first it
Mhm.
was confusing when I was reading it. I'm like, well, why did he make a distinction between grammatical subject? And Finley says in the notes, he says it's confusing because of that. But then as I realized what it was, I'm like, well, okay, I guess it makes sense why he didn't make the distinction, because ultimately, like once you know this, it's the same. It applies to that. And it really helps to just keep that system that we kind of outlined in the beginning in mind when you read this, so that way you kind of know what to look for. I highly recommend you do that. That kind of makes all the difference, in my opinion. Um, the notion is known through the various propositions which are made of subjects and predicates. This movement of propositions requires the movement of the subject through its predicates and then back into itself in the end. This is the working of the notion coming to know itself. The movement through predicate is thus counterthrust because it leads to a new grammatical subject or grammatical subjects to which our thinking is bound. New subjects, which in relation to the first subject of the proposition are predicates, then force us to reevaluate the meaning of the predicate, and also that of the first subject, to which our thinking naturally wants to refer back to, which is that other side of the counter thrust that he mentions. Because we
So
move,
would this be like a chain of Venn diagrams?
yeah, because the Venn diagram applies to subject substance as well as it does to notion,
So
and
it's
reality.
like a link of chains. It's like a chain,
Yes, and
basically.
ultimately,
Like how the hoops of a chain are linked together.
yes, it's a chain of reasoning, of true reasoning in his view, and it
And
refers.
the places where the chain intersects is the notions.
Yeah, it's where they intersect. It's the notions, and that takes the form of predicates and subjects, and then the predicates become subjects when we analyze the predicates as such, and then so on and so forth. But there is that counter thrust because then we get like thrown back into that subject predicate distinction again, and then the other side of the counter thrust is to then return to the original subject uh, in the philosophical analysis, right? So Gabriel Sprach, and then all those predicates we made, which then became subjects, which then we predicated the subjects. Uh, that chain itself in between Gabriel Sprach and those subjects and predicates, that's a
The
counter
original
thrust.
subject gets submerged
Yeah, and but then
and reasserts itself every time. Is that right?
yeah, it reasserts itself every time, but then ultimately it comes back to like it gets referred back to in itself. Okay, after I did all this analysis of what Gabriel Sprach is, I can now say Gabriel Sprach is this because I went through all
You
of
get a
his
fuller
predicates.
understanding of who
Correct,
Gabriel Sprach is.
correct, and
You
that's
get a
the
wealth
opposite
of
side.
knowledge through dialectical reasoning.
Exactly, and that's the
Mm.
sort of counter thrust coming to full fruition. You return back to where you started, but you return back to where you started with a fuller understanding. And but then of course, like there is, like when I say counter thrust, well, he says counter thrust, but the best way to picture this is like, well, okay, we can't escape that predicate subject relation throughout the process. So that there's this countering, we're stuck in that thinking, which is proper to philosophical thought anyway. But then the other side that ultimately throws us back to where we started, but it throws us back in a more wealthier uh, position than we were when we started. So because we move from the initial position of the grammatical subject into its predicate, which reveals the subject and also what it is not, it's also equally as important. It forces us to then treat the new predicate as subject, but because our thinking doesn't want to lose sight of the first subject, which has been submerged into these predicates, which have not only described it, but determined it in the sense that they show what it is and what it can't be, we refer back to the original subject in thought to keep our thinking in line. The movement from subject to predicate into new subject and back into the first subject describes this counterthrust of our thinking when confronted with the we only got about 3 pages left, so we're almost done here. Movement
Mhm.
of the notion in its form through proposition. This form is inescapable and necessary for the movement of speculative thought. So Hegel illustrates this concretely with the proposition God is being. Here, the subject God is said to be, in essence, being. Its predicate, and being is its predicate. But its predicate isn't merely just an aspect, but its entire essence. Now, when one thinks through this proposition, they begin to think of what being is, and thus the subject of the proposition God has been moved away from. Once the thinking consciousness comes to realize what being is, then the full meaning of God is revealed, and the subject reappears from its submergence in the universal predicate being, which the speculative thinker shifted focus to as new subject in order to understand the first subject, of which it was its predicate, but also its substance and necessity. The grammatical subject on its own, God, isn't intelligible without resorting to its predicate being, and then being as its predicate which becomes grammatical subject for thinking, must also be understood via predicate, and the process never ends because if it did, then it would be the cessation of speculative thought into picture and no longer philosophy. Now, this doesn't mean you can't have an understanding of what God is or anything, but ultimately you don't want to become too comfortable because it can lead to problems. Which isn't to say you have to like give up all aspects of what you believe to be true about a certain thing, but it should just as a good practice, it should be well. Okay, let me make sure There's no contradictions here, and if there are, let me work them out so that way I can come to a fuller understanding. And I mean, that's kind of like, why like councils and religions are important, because the councils in religion, they do kind of exercise, without knowing it perhaps by name, a dialectical process of reasoning. Like you had like the first like ecumenical councils talking about, well, what is God, right? Like, his essence is one with the Son, and there were people who didn't agree with that, and people showed why that's a problem for the whole of the religion, and why it must be this way, not that way. That's dialectical reasoning in like the most historical form that's ever existed, actually. Um, so, and of course, like from a Christian perspective, there's if you're a Christian, you wouldn't just say that, oh, well, these guys were just reasoning through that perfectly because they're geniuses, but like you would say that those councils are guided by the Holy Spirit or whatever. But that doesn't really, you know, add, or well, maybe I guess it does add to the, if you're a Hegelian Christian, you might say that, well, the fact that like the all knowing is guiding that process proves that the all knowing knows which way we are supposed to know, and it's dialectical. So I don't know, just a little something I thought was interesting that could be added to that example of God as being there. Um, so
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you should bring up like a bunch of stuff about Christianity throughout. But I would say Hegel's relationship with Christianity is very complex and
yeah,
an entirely separate uh, subject of
yeah.
discussion.
I just want to say I'm not talking about Hegel's relation to Christianity. I just mean like you could take what he's talking about here, and you could say, hey, wait, the early Christians having councils on like what the nature of God is, and saying it can't, if it's this way, it leads to this. If it's this way, it leads to that, and this is good, this is bad. That's an example of real, proper knowing and thinking.
Yeah,
Um,
but inevitably, when you bring up examples from Christianity, you find some discrepancies with this stuff. Because I mean, in the previous episode, we discussed, I asked the question: does Hegel identify absolute spirit with God? And we can really figure this out. Like, does he think it's God or does he not?
Sure. If you were to take Hegel's system as a whole to be true, yes, you would. But what I'm saying specifically is just the reasoning process itself here. I don't think like you could, he would argue, yes, it leads to my system. Of course, he would argue that, but he would also say like, well, this is what philosophy is, and ancients did it. I have my critiques of them, he would say, but they ultimately did do it, and I'm just showing an example of like that in a historical context. Um, so I
Mhm.
don't really think it's necessarily contradictory. This like Hegel doesn't say that like you know I think it's important to understand that Hegel's not saying that he invented this necessarily. That like this form of thinking is he's like, oh well, this is how we think, and here I laid it out. Well, he did lay it out, but he would say, look, this is how real philosophy is done. Here are examples in the past of it being done, but I'm going to lay it out in a more rigorous manner so we can like use it as a tool. And I think it leads to this. And he has his reasons, and people may disagree with that. But yeah, I don't know. That's just why I brought up that example, because I wanted to show a concrete historical example of like taking things and reasoning them through, showing what they can and can't be, showing where they collapse if they're taken to be something. And I mean, that's just, I think, an undeniable example of what is being said here, personally. So yeah, moving
Awkward
on.
silence.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you disagree with that. I don't really see how anyone could disagree with that, though.
I don't really have much to say.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, I'm just clarifying what I was saying
We we
before.
we would have to. I think we would. Yeah, that's fine. Like, you're using a historical example, and the church fathers necessarily use some sort of dialectical
Yeah.
reasoning.
Well, the
They
thing
try
is,
to make distinctions
yeah,
with their language. This is a normal process all throughout philosophy
yeah, exactly.
in
It's not.
general. If you go back to the ancient Greeks,
Yeah, I think
but
the word dialectic is not its origin is with the ancient Greeks. It's not with Hegel.
mhm.
So, but anyway, yeah. So This is how the notion works itself out through the propositions which contain the subject predicate relation, which are never fully complete as they rely on the abstractions of substance into the thinking subject notion, and therefore not fully aligned with substance, but only somewhat which necessitates the constant movement through the abstractions via the self moving notion, the same as thinking subject, which has its form in propositions that contain subjects and predicates moved by said notion. If the notion isn't moved back to the first subject in the chain of relation and instead lost within the movement to its predicate as new subject, the firm basis of thinking has been lost, and the process of inquiry has been shattered since its starting point has been lost. This is when the notion must relate all propositions back to itself, and this includes its form in first subject. The process can never end because it ceases to be true knowing, but it must always keep its wholeness intact. So I mean that kind of just goes back to what we were saying before. Like you have to that it has to reappear. If it doesn't reappear, you're then talking about something else at that point. You've moved into a different subject of discussion. If the first prime subject of analysis is lost in the process. Um, the movement of the notion through propositions is the essence of true philosophical science. The fact that subject predicate in its determinations, which guide our thinking, forces us to understand the content within the proposition in a new manner than how it first appears to us. That is what is meant by, quote, other than we meant it to mean. What we wanted to understand, the truth, was different at a certain point in time than what we thought we understood. What we really meant was the truth all this time, but our idea of the truth, which wasn't complete, was other than we meant when we come to realize the true meaning. What we meant was the truth, but because our idea of the true of truth was wrong or incomplete, we then said something we did not intend in the sense that we intended the full truth. But since this wasn't the full truth, we said other than the full truth without realizing. Since the full truth was what was desired, and we said the incomplete truth, thinking it was the full, we then said other than our intention. This requires an intellectual labor which many people do not have the discipline to do. So they cast the labor itself as useless. If the purely ratiocinative or ratiocinative, I think, but that actually might be, by the way, like an American pronunciation. Because when I was listening to Sadler say it, he was saying it that way, and I was saying it the same way you were. Anyway, which is just argumentative and purely negative. Uh, a way of thinking is conflated with speculative thinking. This is because an issue. With speculative thinking, this becomes an issue because the purely negative isn't a fully moving notion. It's just passed beyond a notion, but not into any notion, which is the essence of speculative thinking. If this is the case, then we are only given the relation of predicates to subjects and other predicates without knowing the deeper truth underlying all of them. We are once again juxtaposing pictures of thought, which are taken to be absolute against one another, never getting to the essence of what's underneath those pictures, which is what speculative thinking is. This is the goal of plasticity, the goal of changing our minds through the act of speculative thinking, which reshapes our knowing and thus experience of the world. Non speculative ways of thinking do have their place, of course. They are the building blocks upon which we can begin the speculative process, which disregards their image as such and goes beneath them. This form of thinking must be explicitly stated from the movement across propositions and not just the inhibition or negation without positing the next proposition in which the content of the notion returns to itself through the whole process. The subject moves into predicate, then is lost in it, but comes back out of it once it refers back to the subject once more in the chain of reasoning through propositions which contain subject and predicate, all of which are the notion moving itself. This is the distinction between ratiocinative and speculative. The mere negation of subjects into predicates versus the negation of subject into the predicate, but the predicate revealing the subject's real innerness of truth through it. The grammatical subject is, in essence, the truth that is being worked out through the process of speculative thinking. On a grander scale, the subject moves through substance, but this movement through substance comes back into the subject, and back out of all of this reveals the truth of the subject through this process. In order for this to work, substance must refer back to the subject, which in its essence, which is the truth. Proper speculative thinking moves beyond the subject but retains it as it moves beyond it, making it more complete. This is the movement of the notion, which is alive through the subject and is intrinsic to it. The notion's self determination is through the thinking subject, which actualizes its unraveling inherent to it. The notion is alive as the thinking subject. The self determination of the notion is the activity of the thinking subject. Speculative thinking, which moves beyond but also retains the notion through this movement, fills the same role a proof in geometry does, as it shows the full steps in the final conclusion containing the truth within each step, although not fully. And that's important as well. Like if you're going to do philosophy and you want to treat it seriously as a serious discipline, you have to show your work. You can't just posit things, you can't just assert things, you have to show how you got there. I mean, that is what philosophy is. If you're not really doing that, you're kind of just saying things at that point. And that's not philosophy isn't just saying things. Um, it's a discipline. It's you should treat it like you would treat mathematics, like you would treat science. Um, you have to show how you got to where you got. And that's I mean that makes sense, everything considered. So, okay, as regards proof, there is a distinction between dialectical proof in philosophy and purely proof by ordinary reason. Proof by ordinary reason seeks to look externally to the notion. It is trying to prove, in order to prove it, by merely relating predicates to subject alone. Dialectical proof seeks to take the subject and its predicates and unravel them from within and look at what they are in themselves, where they lead from their own being in themselves, and what happens when we think through them from their own standpoint. This is why the dialectical proof cannot admit anything it has not unraveled from within the notion itself, and must only allow it to show what it leads to in itself from its own standpoint. Ordinary proof seeks to relate predicates to subject, assuming it already knows the fullness of both, and all it has to do is demonstrate how they relate to one another, without actually digging into what either of them are in their own identity and where they led us to from there. This is why it is relating external notions to one another instead of relating the notion back to itself through its own dissection from reasoning within it. Within the dialectical movement of the notion through predicates, we see simply put this process subject into predicate back into subject, revealing the truth of both in the proposition, and then this proposition leads to the next proposition in which the same process occurs, but through this notion is working itself out, and ultimately the starting and end point through which it takes the form in the proposition which subjects and predicates are made of it revealing its full self through the process. The propositions also relate backward just as much as they do forward, as the proposition qualifies the meaning of all others in the whole of the working. What is true in a forward manner, if said backwards, is also true. The second proposition reveals a truth about the first, not contained within the first, but is a product of working out the first into the second through exposing its inner nature and where it leads. The underlying notion is present within the whole process being worked out, as that is what it is for the notion to be. The truth, notion, is the starting and end of the movement, but through this movement it comes to know itself fully. The notion is the subject above all the grammatical subjects and predicates in the form and dynamic of proposition. Thus, content without underlying subject has no meaningful predicates, since predicates are proper to subject. If this is the case, then there is empty form. This empty form leads to no real knowledge because there is nothing there to know. The issue often comes up, for instance, when one speaks of God without qualifying the meaning of that subject in the grammatical sense first. It isn't until we qualify it that we can truly know its predicates and then begin the process, not if it remains empty. With all this, we can conclude that if we want philosophy to be taken seriously, there must be a element of professionalism and training involved. It shouldn't be up to the untrained to do it. Just like a scientist must be trained over the course of years until he reaches a certain level, so too must the true philosopher who can develop thought and the way in which we think as well. The real philosopher cannot be lazy and must be rigorous. He must take things as they are and dig into them until they are revealed in their full truth as such. Philosophy can no longer be the mere art of assertions or intuitions, but a real way of thinking and analyzing that sees the content for what it is through its determinations found in their own starting point as subjects, then into their predicates, whilst not forgetting the subject through the predicates, which in the end reveal the truth of the subject all along, as well as the predicates, which too are held under this process. and that's when they turn into subjects, etc. The end goal of Hegel's philosophy is to provide a complete form of science and knowing, which isn't to say he claims that he has the answer to all particular questions, but rather he knows the system in which this occurs. This system of absolute negativity and constant movement of reality, which, because we can never fully grasp, as we are always stuck at first within picture thought, we must humble ourselves to know that we can never know everything, but that we can always keep knowing, albeit never fully. We are limited beings nested within the unlimited, which one can only know in a limited manner. To know absolutely is to know that we can never fully know the absolute in itself. That is, absolute knowing, which by virtue of its words sounds prideful, is paradoxically, as a concept, the most humbling. The absolute form of knowing is to know that our knowing occurs within the system which, in its essence as negativity, can't be known in itself, but only through its particulars, which, through knowing the particulars, we come to know reality as one with it through them. To know absolutely is to know that the process of knowing can never end and is always subject to revision, and that we must never become too comfortable with the familiar, which clouds and stunts our knowing if taken as absolute in its repose. To know knowing as such is to know it in its evanescence, or its essence as evanescence, maybe you could also say. So that's basically all the notes we have for the preface. That is done. I want to just say one last thing before.
So hold on. So
Okay.
based off of this, it is impossible to complete the system of German idealism.
Well, yes. It depends what you mean by complete, though. Because if you mean complete, like, oh, we can point to this thing and say it's this and nothing but this, uh, yes, and it's a paradox. Reality, I guess, for Hegel at the end of it all is a paradox because you can't know absolute knowing in itself. Because if you try to do that, you're going to create a picture of absolute knowing, and the picture is, of course, not the same thing as what it is in itself. So that would be to fall back into what we're trying to get out of. But what we can do is we can say, look, we know that we're stuck in this system, and to know that is to know enough. That is what it means to know absolutely. And that's essentially what he's getting at. So you can't complete it in the sense that you could sit at a fixed picture and say this is what it is. That's correct, but you can say in a sense, well, I know it's this and not that, so it's complete in that way for sure, but not complete in the way of here's this pure picture that I can point to, and it's this thing, and it is this thing in itself. The most you can say, I have a picture of what the absolute is. I know that it's not the absolute, and it's limited, and the absolute is sort of beyond my grasp. But accepting that is what it means to know fully in a way. So it's sort of paradoxical, if that makes sense.
But will Donald Trump still be able to complete the system of German idealism?
Well, I think he's acting dialectically now because he went from not saying not to release the Epstein files to releasing the Epstein files. So I think he is a
Okay.
dialectical thinker. Um,
So
and
Kantbot is right.
Talbot is correct. And you know what? I love it. I love right when we end the podcast, my phone, the world decides to blow up my phone. I'm not going to answer. Um, but there's one thing I want to just say here. So if you've, to any loyal viewers who had the patience to stick through 2 hours and 17 minutes, God bless you. Um, what Hegel did in the preface is what we just outlined basically is we just outline the way in which this whole book is going to unfold. The rest of the book that we're going to go through, the individual stages of consciousness or spirit, they're all going to relate back to the original subject, which is spirit itself. So what we're reading is also the structure of the book in the preface, funnily enough, and we're reading how that's going to unfold in a very condensed manner, and he's going to take that out over a long period of time throughout the rest of the book. And that's kind of what I was saying before. It's kind of like, kind of surreal to read Hegel and grasp what he's saying, because you understand the act of I'm literally reading about what I'm reading is what's occurring when you read this book. When you're reading the preface, I'm reading the way in which it's written out is the way in which subject is the way in which we come to know ourselves. That's what makes it such a weird, like, spooky book in a sense. It's no surprise to those who've read it have attached this sort of aura to it, because the book is basically telling you it's like explaining itself in a way, but it's also explaining you. Like, you read, like, you're explaining yourself through reading the book. Basically, That's how I would put it.
That's something I haven't experienced yet. I haven't really applied it to my own mental process of me reading the words on the page and trying to make sense of them. So maybe
Well,
that's something I still have to go through.
yeah, I mean, this see, of course, like I'm coming at this from somebody who read this months ago, and like we're at like a different thing here, so that's understandable. And I didn't realize it until we went through the preface. After having,
Mm.
and I thought I understood the book. I thought had a good understanding of Hegel when I
Yeah,
was
you
first.
read the entire corpus and then you read the preface, so you skipped the preface.
Exactly, and yeah, and that's often recommended, and I think that that's the reason why, because when you read the preface, what you're reading is you're reading what you're doing to yourself. It's such a weird thing to realize, like, oh, I'm reading about myself, understanding myself, and the act of reading is me understanding myself. Okay, that's kind of funny. It's a very, and I wonder if he
Yeah,
knew
you,
it.
you said before how it like tied it all up into a nice little
Yeah,
present for you.
it did, but it's sort of distinct from saying like, oh, it just puts these things into perspective, which it does put things into perspective, of course. But it's just weird because it's like, okay, uh, the movement itself is implied in the reading, which is about me, about this thing that's moving, and like I'm reading about myself through the book, and going through that process is me coming to know myself. So
Would you
it's
say that was a spiritual experience?
yeah. Well, that's the thing. I hate to see like a certain group of women get their hands on this thing and completely, sink their teeth into it. And
You gotta read a little bit of Hegel touch grass and then read a Hegel again.
yeah. Well, there was the one girl in that group who seemed to have a good, decent understanding, but everybody else, I was like, and I don't want to come off as the guy who's like, I'm a Hegel understander because I mean I just read this book once or whatever, but
Yeah, for all of you Hegelian e-girls, if you're listening in on this podcast, Gabe's single.
no, no, I see. I'm an incel. I don't look. But actually, when I said my profile picture wasn't me, that's a lie. That's me in the profile picture. I look like that. So,
Okay, well, if you're willing to date someone like that, if you're willing to look past his appearance,
yeah,
if you're not shallow,
yeah,
he's single, ladies.
yeah. Okay, so on that note, we're gonna end here. Thank you everyone who stuck by. We're probably gonna come out with another couple episodes in a few weeks. It takes a little bit to read this and then get the notes and then make sure everything we have is correct. But anyways, yeah, we'll call it a day here. And of course, there we go.